Okay, so I think we'll get going. So firstly, a very warm welcome to this Society webinar on Research Futures 2.0. So thanks very much indeed for joining. Next slide, please, Adrian. Yeah, next slide, Adrian. Yeah, thank you.
No, sorry, it's just a bit slow there. Sorry.
Slow, sorry. Rush on there. Yeah, so thanks very much indeed for joining. So the agenda here, we'll come on to introductions in a minute. So essentially last year, we produced a report looking at the future of research. So what's going to happen in the future, particularly in the context of a post-pandemic world. So Adrian's going to be talking through an overview, providing an overview of that report, looking at the top line results, and then have a chance at the end for questions that you have. So I should say at this point that the session is being recorded. And what we would do is we will provide a nice Societies Update article, which will be sent out to you afterwards. So keep an eye out for that. And also, if you have any questions, your audio will be muted, but I'd encourage you, and please do ask questions using the chat function. And what I would do is I will hand over in a minute to Adrian to present. And at the end, he will then come back to me and then we'd pick up those all-important questions. So do ask questions as we go along. Thank you. Next slide. And just a couple of introductions. So for those of you that I haven't met, my name's Steve Wims, Society Business Director, and I work in Elsevier's Journals Group, also known as STMJ. And I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Adrian Mulligan. Adrian is Research Director and works in Elsevier's Customer and Market Insights Group. So with that, Adrian, over to you.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Steve, for the introduction. Yeah, I head up the Customer and Market Insights team here at Elsevier, and we undertake quite a lot of research studies. A lot of it is to understand how our business is performing, but also just looking more broadly at the kind of research kind of landscape and thinking about like what the future of research might look like. And so back in 2019, working closely with Ipsos, we conducted a study to really understand what the potential futures of research might be. We did this through the prism of scenarios. So the idea is really to look at what the possible futures could be. The beauty of scenarios is that you come up with plausible futures. So no one scenario is likely to come true, but it's a way of helping shape your own thinking about things that you could possibly be doing now to ensure that you thrive and succeed in the future. So this study really was critical to our thinking, and we thought it was so fundamental that we wanted to share it more broadly within the research community. And the way that we did think about these possible futures is to root them in the kind of trends that we're kind of seeing today. So it is very much foundational. And the trends that we identified were 19 in total. And we grouped them into 6 major themes when we did this original study. So you can see them here. You got funding, how researchers work, technology, open science, the research information system, so how research is communicated, and the role of the academy, what role institutions play and universities, and how that's shifting and changing. And when we did this study back in 2019, working with Ipsos, it was split into a number of different phases. The very first phase was a series of expert interviews that we did with individuals around the world, so research leaders, librarians, tech companies, and it was with approximately about 50. We then followed that up with a survey which involved over 2,000 researchers. And then finally, we brought it all together in workshops, all those results, and analyzed them in order to develop possible future scenarios. So those workshops really helped us think about the future and to generate these 3 scenarios. And the 3 scenarios that we developed for the future were Brave Open World, Tech Titans, and Eastern Ascendants. So we did that foundational work in 2019, and I'll describe a little bit more what those scenarios were. But what we want to try and do is to come back to those scenarios and subsequently to understand how they've progressed and how they've changed, and particularly, as Steve said at the start, how the pandemic has impacted the research world and these particular scenarios. So if I walk through each of these scenarios now, we have Brave Open World, which is really a world in the future in which global philanthropic organizations and state bodies and governments come together to align in kind of goals and approaches. And the consequence of this was that open science, open research really takes off, and we see Europe playing a really key role. And the whole shift, if you like, that we see towards open science is enabled by underlying technologies, particularly artificial intelligence. And in this world, the kind of funding organizations, the kind of state actors are acting in concert with technology companies to enable access to research information via interoperable platforms, interoperable global platforms. Then we have tech titans. This is where there's been significant advances in technology, particularly artificial intelligence. And I think we probably could all agree that over the last 3 months, ChatGPT and its advancements has really kind of driven this potential scenario. But the innovations that we see here in this space allows technology companies to play a much greater role in supporting the research ecosystem. They become the knowledge creators and the curators in this world, and really they kind of wrestle the control away from the traditional publishers. And they will work kind of closely in this world with philanthropic organizations, but they are really the curators in this environment. They're the ones that are perhaps controlling the distribution of the research and actually playing an active role in research as well. And then finally, the third scenario is Eastern ascendance. And this is where we see, China's role being predominant in the future, based largely on the amount of money that it's spending on R&D. And it starts to really strongly influence the kind of research agenda, almost dominating it. So in this world, we see researchers who are thinking about what they do next and where they should relocate, and thinking about China as the possible destination. And actually, historically, researchers may probably wanted to go to MIT or Oxford, but in this scenario, we see them as actually going towards China as being the institutions that they want to be best that they want to be placed at. So these are the scenarios that we came up with in 2019. And as I said, we wanted to revisit these and actually just really understand what the impact of the pandemic has been on the development of these scenarios. And it's important, as I mentioned right at the start, to understand that it's unlikely no single scenario will come true, but rather different elements of these scenarios will probably come true. And I think to some extent we've seen this. So that was the kind of goal of revisiting these particular scenarios, if you like. And the approach that we adopted was to do an online survey. And we did 2 waves. We did one in 2020, August 2020, at the height of the pandemic, and then we did one in August 2021, just as the pandemic was finishing, and most countries had eased their restrictions. The 2 studies typically had about 1,000 responses across those 2 waves. And for those of you interested in statistics, as we go through the deck, the slides, you'll see some green ticks and red ticks and some green dots and some red dots. So the ticks basically mean the results are statistically different from the previous wave. So 21 to 2020. And then the dots indicate whether a subgroup's score or a percentage degree is actually different to the global position. Okay, so what did we find out when we revisited some of the kind of themes that we identified in the original study? So if I go through each one in turn, if we first talk a little bit about the funding landscape, and what we found is that researchers at the end of the pandemic in August were less optimistic about funding. So the numbers saying that there's sufficient funding in their field had dropped. So it had gone down by 6 points. So it was statistically significant. And fundamentally, the whole, most researchers, just 50%, actively believe there's insufficient funding in their field. So there's a proportion, of course, that are passive, but there's 50% believe there's insufficient funding is kind of quite a concern for the sector. And when we looked at the reasons why they felt that funding perhaps was was sufficient. They tended to be from those fields where the research that they were doing was in vogue, particularly if it was around COVID-19 when we were actually executing this particular study. And for those that disagreed, it was the kind of flip side. So for those people that were not executing COVID research, they felt that they were losing funding to research that was being conducted on COVID. They felt that there was limited funding opportunities in their particular field, so they saw that the amount of opportunities were reducing just generally, independent of the pandemic, and also coupled with that, they saw more researchers coming into their field, which is basically increasing the competition. So when we asked researchers to kind of think about what might happen kind of going forward, they kind of identified that they thought research institutions would likely to be, to reduce their funding that they're making available to the researchers at their institution. And researchers were thinking that actually that perhaps corporate institutions would step in to replace the funding opportunities that were being dropped by the actual institutions themselves. So what we're looking at here is thinking about the next 2 to 3 years, where do you think that the funding will come from? And so 41% believe it will increase from the corporate sector. And what you're seeing here on the right hand side is the net, which is basically the amount they're thinking is going to decrease minus those that believe it will increase from a particular sector. We also saw during the pandemic the funding requirements increase from the point of view from the researchers. So over half had seen their funding requirements increase over the last 2 to 3 years. And what we did was, when we asked that question, we followed it up to kind of figure out, well, what is it that was behind this increase? And what the researchers were saying was that they'd been asked to increase the number of research publications they were outputting, and they were also saying funders were wanting more progress reporting. Of course, they're feeling the pressure, funders themselves, in terms of demonstrating their impact, and so they're in turn passing that on to the research community. When we looked at how researchers work and the environment that they're in, we saw that there was challenges during the pandemic, as we would expect, and maintaining a work-life balance. But it actually affected some groups more than others. And we saw that women found that a little bit more difficult during COVID. So 62% versus men, 50%. So that's statistically higher. And we also saw that those over the age of 56 had it perhaps a little bit easier. So they were below the global average in terms of having a good look, maintaining a good work-life balance. We also saw during the pandemic collaboration increase, and we saw it increase from 43% in the first year of the pandemic up to 63% by the end of the pandemic. And what we saw is that researchers were saying that there's more collaboration because international collaboration they felt was getting easier, and it was becoming just generally more prevalent amongst the community. They were also recognizing actually doing more collaboration, particularly multidisciplinary research, meant that they would get rewarded for it, and actually funders were requesting it. And it's because as well that digital online communication had intensified during the pandemic, so it effectively enabled it. For those that perhaps said it had decreased, and that's a minority, only 13%. But they kind of highlighted it was due in part to the fact that they weren't seeing colleagues anymore due as a part of the pandemic and the restrictions that had been imposed. And as mentioned a little bit earlier, they perceived that there was a kind of lack of funding that was reducing the need to collaborate on particular projects. And then when we looked at the mobility of researchers and their willingness to relocate, we saw towards the end of the pandemic that the that a number were considering relocating as compared to before the pandemic. So it increased to 34% from 27 in 2019. And what we saw was that the kind of main driver for that increase was better facilities, better funding at other locations, and ensuring that they kind of maintain that work-life balance. Those attributes here on the kind of far right were the ones that increased the most over the time frame that we were measuring. So we measured it on a like-for-like basis over those 3 time windows, and that's where we saw a significant shifts. So historically, during the pandemic, of course, people were going to stay close to the institutions that were working, not really considering. So we'd probably expect a bump to some extent. But just kind of thinking back to the scenarios, the question then became, well, where would they be willing to relocate? Because we had one of our scenarios was Eastern Ascendants. So we were kind of looking, particularly, would they be willing to relocate to China and places? So we asked the willingness to relocate to particular countries, and you can see, just before the pandemic, the USA was the highest, most attractive destination. This drops to 8% during the pandemic, but then as we move through to 2021, you can see the US is back up again. It's at 14%. UK is a very attractive destination too, as is Canada. So perhaps the traditional destinations as before the pandemic. And what we found is that China, in absolute terms, remained relatively low at 2%. But you could argue it had doubled from 1%, but that relatively, I don't think it's going to be as significant. It's still overall relatively low. Okay, so technology. So one of the things that we asked about in the kind of follow-up studies was your role of AI, particularly, is where we kind of had focused. And what we did when we asked about AI was we were asking the extent to which people were using AI in their research. And so what we presented to the respondents was a 5-point scale where 5 represented extensively, very extensively, in they're using it in research, to with 1 the other end of the scale saying not at all. And what you're looking at here is the sum of those that indicated 4 or 5. So it's quite a harsh measure. And you can see here that in total, the amount that's saying that they're extensively using AI in their research is 16%. That represents a 4-point shift from the year before. Those are the grey bars in the background, and that's a significant shift. You can see quite clearly that computer science is really high, which is what we would expect. At 64%, much higher than the kind of global average. But what's quite interesting is when you can see the change over time, and you can see that chemists and material scientists have both increased their rather the researchers have increased the use of AI in their own research, 2 to 19% for chemists, and from 0 through to 18% for material scientists. So we're seeing some kind of shifting, but broadly across the community, you can see that more are using AI. So the question then became was, how are they using AI, in what capacity within research? And what we've done here is we've kind of broken the results by how they're using it. So whether they're using it to analyze results, process large data sets, or to generate new hypotheses. Something that came out of the original study in 2019 was that scientists would increasingly use AI to generate hypotheses rather than perhaps coming up with them themselves. And what you can see here is the breaks across the different disciplines. So most are using it to analyze results, to help with the analysis at 66%. But there are a couple of areas where there's differences. So you can see that medicine is disproportionately high for the amount that are using it to generate a hypothesis at 31%. And you can also see, Appear Life Sciences are predominantly using it for the analysis. So there are some different flavors of how AI is being used, and you can see in computer science it's quite high for actually helping conduct the research. So not at the analysis phase, but actually, pulling together their research projects and undertaking the research. So there are some differences across the different subject fields. And finally, what we wanted to, well, not finally actually, but one of the key areas that we wanted to look at, because it was so important to the one scenario, was open science. And what we found is that open science is, as I'm sure you all would have expected, has accelerated and is more widespread than it was back in 2019. And one particular area where we saw that it had accelerated was in the use of preprints, and the value of preprints during the pandemic shot up. So 2/3 considered by the end of the pandemic that preprints were a valued source of information, so up by 23%. And when we asked researchers why that was, they told us it was because it gave them the opportunity to see the publication prior to being shared in journals. And they saw that as very valuable. It enabled them to keep up to date in a more efficient way, they considered, particularly when there was a massive press of research articles being published during the pandemic. And ultimately as well, it's because it's easier to access that content than perhaps through subscriptions, journal subscriptions. And when it came to looking at why people disagreed, because there was still a number, but a lot less that they that thought preprints were valuable, and it was because they lacked peer review. There was no validation associated with them, and really for them, for these particular researchers, the true value is in seeing it in the kind of final version in the journal. So that, of course, lending its authority, but nonetheless, generally speaking, lots more researchers were using preprints and actually posting their articles on preprint servers as well. And what we also saw during the pandemic was there was more sharing of data, and what we see is that 52% said that they were sharing more data during the pandemic than 2 to 3 years before. And the reasons for that is because it enabled them to ensure that the data was widely available, so that others could take advantage of it. And they believed themselves that it was, just generally more productive to kind of share their data, and because it's being actively encouraged. So funders are actually stipulating it now, and we also see more recently that the OSTP has mandated zero embargoes on research articles. So it's just part of the paradigm shift that we're seeing in terms of scholarly communication. When it came to disagreeing with this particular statement, in terms of those that are not sharing more, it was essentially because it's just been maintained at the level it was before for a number. Some it was because they were just simply conducting less research, compared to 2 to 3 years previously. And what we also saw is that some researchers want to maintain the intellectual property of the data, if you like, and take full advantage of it. And that's been a reoccurring theme when we've looked at this particular statement in historical studies going back 10 years. So there's more of it now, but there's still the some of the legacy reasons for not sharing data are maintained. But there were some particular points during the pandemic which caused some people not to share. Okay, so what we wanted to look at next was the kind of university system, the academy, if you like, and the impact of the changes of the pandemic to education. And so we asked the community um, whether they thought the shift to online teaching had negatively impacted students. I mean, I think we all recognize that during the pandemic, there was a massive shift to digital teaching. And, what we found is very few relatively agreed that it was positive. In fact, the majority, just a slight majority, 50%, 53% disagreed that it positively impacted students. And there were various reasons for this. When it came to disagreeing, you know, the respondents thought it was because it meant there was less effective and less engaged students in terms of the communication devices were less effective, and as a consequence, the students were perhaps a little bit disengaged. There was less interpersonal connections, less informal discussion. And for a number, and this probably affects certain fields more than others, there was the kind of lack of hands-on work that they were able to do, and we've subsequently seen it in other studies that we're doing at the moment, particularly in medicine, where this was perceived by the kind of physician community as a particular restriction during the pandemic. So they're seeing a wave of new clinicians come true that lack that practical hands-on experience. For those that agreed that it was a good thing, it's mostly from their own personal point of view. So it allowed them to have a better work-life balance. Enabled them to have greater access to materials online, and it was just just generally a little bit more convenient for the lecturers and teachers to do it online than to do it physically in the lecture theatre. Okay, so one of the things that was really important for us to do within this particular study is to get researchers to think about the long-term impact of COVID. So the last few slides really have talked about the transition that's occurred. And what we wanted to understand is, like, thinking further forward, what do researchers think the long-lasting implications are going to be? And so what you're going to see in this next slide is a series of statements or areas where we thought, there might be some positive impact and maybe some negative impact in a particular area. So let me just quickly walk you through how this works. So the question that we asked is, do you think the longer term impact of COVID-19 will likely lead to more flexible working patterns? So the green bars here at the top are where it's increased, or there's going to be more. So we have here, for this particular first statement, flexible working patterns, we have what we described as a net score. So this is the score of taking the more, the increased side of the response, and minusing away those that perceive that it's going to be less or it's going to decrease. So you get this net impact. So you can see here that flexible working patterns, by and large, for most of the community, is going to be a kind of, it's going to be more of it kind of going forward, and for many it's a positive thing. And then you've got right to the other end of the slide, you've got the kind of the areas where they believe there's going to be less of this in the future, and there's going to be a decrease. And so a lot of researchers believed that the number of students going to university was actually going to decline, and so the net figure here is -16. So you can see there's a range here. So on the left-hand side, they believe that there's going to be more cross-disciplinary working, and there's going to be a greater focus on societal impact of research. And then amongst the other things that are perhaps going to be negatively impacted by COVID or reduced, experimental work, so field work, they perceive perhaps would be reduced in the future. And as we kind of highlighted right at the start when we talked about funding, they believe that the funding of ongoing research is likely to drop as well. So these are all the kind of top level results, if you like, from our study. There are full reports that are available, and if you go to to the Elsevier.com website, you'll be able to navigate through to the full reports. So you've got the original one back in 2019 that we did with Ipsos, and that report is, I think, probably about 120 pages, and the more recent one is kind of similar, but a similar number, maybe slightly less. And I mean, I know that sounds kind of daunting in terms of the size, but they've been structured in a way so that they're kind of like bite-sized pieces, so you can go into particular sections or chapters and read in depth about what's going on in a particular area. So if it's the advances that have been made in technology, and there's a bite-sized piece at the front, which is maybe a paragraph just to give you the headlines of what we've learned, and then a much deeper, richer section that might run to like, I don't know, 10 pages or so. And as part of that, you have a literature review in there, as well as the kind of results from this particular study. So it's a combination of a literature reviewed results from this study to give you a flavour of what we think is currently going on along those different themes that we've identified. So that's the kind of key findings from the study. And I'm going to go back to Steve, and should there be any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those.
Great, thanks very much, Adrian. Yeah, very, very interesting. A lot of data and work went into that report, I'm aware. So I've actually put the link to the report in the chat, so you can pick it up from the chat if you want to read the report in more detail. So I don't know if there's any questions, but feel free to add them to the chat. If not, there's a couple that came through before. One of them was whether there's any plans to repeat this study or the report in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes is the short answer to that question. So when we did the original report in 2019, the plan was to repeat it, but the time window that we had originally thought about for repeating it was around about 4 or 5 years. But of course, the pandemic came along in between, and made us rethink about the timing for that study. So we did it a little bit earlier than we had originally planned, but we will revisit it probably in another 2 years, I would say. I think it's probably worth coming back to. We're always very conscious of changes that are going on in the market. So, in our 3 scenarios that we had come up with originally, the technology one, really, I think, and there's a lot of the drivers and a lot of the trends that we had originally identified back in 2019 that have come to fruition, and we really expected the AI kind of shifts to be transformative, and I think we have seen that to be the case. So it'll be interesting to see what the impact of that, particularly ChatGPT, will be, and I suspect another year or 2 on will allow us to kind of get a good understanding of what the impact is on research.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, ChatGPT is certainly one of the big ones. That's great. And it kind of linked to that actually is this is mainly aimed at researchers. Do we have something, or are we doing something similar for clinicians or engineers or someone that is more practitioner focused?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Steve. Yes, we have. So the Research Futures project was the first one that we did that looked at a 10-year horizon, and it was very much focused on the research community, but of course medicine was a part of it. And what we did subsequently, and we did last year at the same time, pretty much as we did Research Futures 2.0, is we did a study called Clinician of the Future, and that really looked at the implications for the transitions that we've seen over the last few years on the longer term future for clinicians. And so when I'm talking about clinicians, I mean physicians and nurses. So we looked at some of the challenges that they're facing and what they think is going to happen over a 10-year window, similar to what we've done with Research Futures, but very much focused on clinical practice. It was very interesting to do that study too at the same time and see the 2 sets of results come in. And within the clinician community, there's some unique challenges that they see being ahead, particularly around preventive kind of care. So how to deal with the challenge of so many patients now having chronic conditions.
Great, it's interesting, very interesting to know. Any other questions from anyone? Please use the chat function, or if for whatever reason you don't have the chat function, use the Q&A tab at the bottom. If there's any other questions, that'd be great. If not, we'll close the session shortly, but I need to remember to do the poll, something that I always forget to do, so I need to make sure that I do that before we close. So any other last shout out for any further questions or queries for Adrian? No? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly launch the poll. So the question here is, has this webinar helped your understanding of what the future of research might look like? So I'm going to end the poll. So yes, a little, 71%. I can share the results now, in fact. Yes, a little, 71%. Yes, a lot, 29%. So thanks very much indeed for that. And before we close, there is another question that's come through. Now that's a separate one. So I think with that, I think we'll end the session. So Adrian, a big thanks to you for joining.
No problem.
And thanks everyone else for joining this webinar. As I say, we will make the recording available afterwards via a Society's Update article. But meantime, thanks very much for joining the meeting, and enjoy the rest of today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.